Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are several advances all across the front line, mainly from the Russian forces. The Russians launched several assaults gaining new territory across the Serbets river line, south of the Severodonetsk river, west of Bilorivka, to the north of Toretsk, to the east of Pocrosk, and to the southwest of Pocrosk, west of Korokhove, in the southwestern parts of the Donetsk region. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported the capture of Kamyanka, however it is in the Kharkiv section of the front line. Generally, the reports from that direction have been much more unreliable than the eastern and southern section of the front line, or the northern section. Really, it is the most unreliable section of the front line in terms of these reports, some leaving it as a gray zone until we get further confirmation. The Russians managed to advance here in the Sumi region in the northern section of the front line. However, the Russian assaults and attempts at advancing were met by mines, which halted the advance, and therefore I'm also leaving that as a gray zone. Both of these advances indicate further operations by the Russians in both of these sections of the front line. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, the Russians advanced here west of Korokhove, gaining control over areas west of Rusliv, west of Konstantinopel, to the northwest of Andriivka, securing the fortified positions just outside the town, and some forest lines to the north of Andriivka. These four advances by the Russians all show that the Russians have started a new offensive here west of Korokhove, where they are launching offensive operations towards Bahatir, Oleksivka, the four towns of Bohdanivka, Toretsk, Horihove, Kotlyarivka, as well as the highway here from Dashna in the west to Oleksivka in the east, where the Russians are also striking Ukrainian positions along the highway, where they are attacking all of the Ukrainian supply lines and supplies going through the highway that is connected through Novopavlivka. The Russians are aware that the Ukrainian supply hub in the area is Novopavlivka, therefore the majority of the reconnaissance is taking place alongside this highway from Novopavlivka to the front line. Therefore, the offensive operations by the Russians are centered around advancing towards Novopavlivka and attacking the flanks of this highway. As they are already attacking the Ukrainian supply lines, their positions will be weakening along the front line. We see that the Russians are here working mostly on the northern and southern flanks rather than attacking Oleksivka directly. This is to gain control over Bahatir to the south, to enter Oleksivka through the river line to the south, and also to create a buffer zone and cut off the supplies from that direction. At the same time, they're also attacking from the northern flank to bypass the fortified positions from their weak point in the northern flank. The Russians also managed to advance here in the northern direction near Nadiivka. Following the capture of the town, the Russians are now advancing along the main road towards Kotlyarivka. The Russians have also managed to advance in the northern flank. This is a result of Russian offensive operations to expand the zone of control around Nadiivka, bypassing the fortified positions by attacking the towns and settlements in the area to improve their positions elsewhere, while at the same time the Ukrainians are holding up within the fortified positions and the defensive lines, which allows them to strike the Russian attacks along the main roads and to exert influence through these fortified positions. However, they are unable to launch counterattacks as they do not have any areas to build up their forces. The Russians are here working to secure the settlements and areas where the Ukrainians can build up forces, as if they get control over those, the Ukrainians would be unable to launch counterattacks, and therefore the Russians would be able to capture and consolidate these positions along the fortified positions to advance in the direction of Novomikhailivka and Muravka in the northwestern outskirts. In the direction of Usvinivka, the Ukrainians have lost their foothold within the town. However, the Russians have not moved in to clear the western outskirts of it. This is due to the increased Ukrainian AFU drone activity in the area. The Russians are instead working on securing the supply lines to the south of Novoaleksandrivka and Uzbenivka, pushing the Ukrainians out of the forest lines before moving onwards towards Novoaleksandrivka from the southern and eastern directions, allowing them to use two separate supply lines to enter Novoaleksandrivka. There's also the road and the forest lines to the south of Novoaleksandrivka, which can allow the Russians to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and put them in a pincer from the south and the north. Therefore, we see that the Russians will continue their offensive operations here in this section of the front line, with some developments in the north and in the south. To the east of Pocrosk, we see that the Russians have managed to secure additional forest lines here to the northeast of Yelisavetivka. At the same time, the Ukrainians have managed to recapture several fortified positions in the area. The fighting taking place here northwest of Yelisavetivka led to several Russian advances earlier this month. These advances were mostly centered around the Ukrainians not having significant forces in the area. The Ukrainians built up some forces and launched some counterattacks before the Russians were able to consolidate their positions in these fortified areas. This led to the Ukrainians recapturing several points. The Russians are now moving through the forest lines to the northeast, and with their control and foothold over Lyubivka in the outskirts of the town, the Russians will look to secure the southern parts and then move onwards to flank the Ukrainian positions from the northern and western parts to put the Ukrainians in a pincer and cut off their supply lines. However, the Ukrainians have been building up strong forces in the area. Therefore, we may see a Russian pushback from Lyubivka, where the Ukrainians will be able to cut off their positions and push them back towards Toretsk. This is due to the increased Ukrainian pressure on the Russian positions in the area, while the Russians are strengthening their positions in the east. To counteract this, we'll have to see over the next few days and weeks whether the Russians were prepared for this or not. In the case they were prepared, we may see some activity by the Russians to capture these fortified positions and move upwards along the highway. And if they were unprepared, they would likely be forced to withdraw across the Toretsk river, and the Ukrainians may recapture Yelisavetivka, putting a stop to the Russian advances in the area. Near Toretsk, the Russians continue their advances near Delivka, where they have been continuing their fighting over the forest patch area. The Russians are looking to gain full control of it, which will allow them to flank the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here in between the industrial area to the west and the forest patch area to the east. This will cut off the supplies and encircle the Ukrainian forces in the northern parts of the city. Though with continued fighting within the northern flank of Toretsk, the Russians are looking to secure the city. Further north in the direction of Bilohorivka, the Russians have managed to enter the outskirts of Ryhorivka. Following the capture of the fortified position here in the northern flank, the Russians are continuing their offensive operations to enter Ryhorivka and fight over the fortified positions near the town. The Ukrainians secured the fortified position in the southern flank of the town. However, if the Russians are able to gain control over the fortified positions to the north, they'll be able to flank them from the rear and cut off their supply lines. On the western bank of the Serebets river line, there are several advances by the Russians. There are 4 separate advances to the south of Nove, entering the town of Kulityasi, in between Nove and Kulityasi, and in the northern parts near Makiivka, in the border area between the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Starting out in the south, the Russians managed to gain a foothold in the northern outskirts of Kulityasi, gain control over some fortified positions in the forest patches, gain control over forest line to the outskirts of the town. The Russians are here entering the town to gain a foothold and expand it to gain control over the town. Kulityasi is located on the outskirts of the fortified positions north of Lyman and is one of the final towns beyond the defensive line of Lyman. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the entire road from Katerinivka in the north all the way to Kulityasi in the south for offensive operations towards the defensive lines of the Ukrainians here near Lyman, and also to flank Zarishne from the rear. Therefore, the fighting entering Kulityasi shows that the next stage in the offensive operations of the Russians has started, where they are looking to gain control over the final positions ahead of this defensive line for the final offensive to take place, which will lead to the Russian offensive on Lyman. Therefore, we see that the fighting right now is the final preparation for such a larger offensive. The Russians also managed to gain control over some forest lines and forest patches near Nove, further south and just to the southern outskirts of the town. The Russians are here gaining control over the road, cutting off the connection between Nove, Lipove, and Selena Dolina, and also to secure the southern flank for further offensive operations in the northern flank of the town to encircle the Ukrainian forces within it, either forcing a withdrawal or encircling their forces, which will allow them to gain control over the town. The Russians also managed to advance here east of Novomikhailivka, where they are attacking the fortified positions of the Ukrainians to the east of the town, gaining control over some forest lines and forest patches in the area as they continue to advance along the Luhansk and Donetsk border area. The Russians are here looking to gain full control over the Luhansk region, where they need to gain control over Kharkivka, so we're seeing advances by the Russians in that direction from the southern flank. We'll likely see an increase of Russian advances here near Makiivka as well from the eastern flank of the town. The Russians are also looking to bypass the fortified positions and to advance further to secure the northern flank of Novomikhailivka by gaining control over the fortified positions in the outskirts of it. We do see, however, that the Russian advances in the northern direction has slowed down, while their efforts in the western directions are speeding up. This is to keep up their forces in the western direction with the advances that have been much faster in the northern flank to secure the supply lines and the buffer zone in the western direction as well for further offensive operations both in the south, to the west, and to the north. Further north along the Oskar river line, the Russians continue their offensive operations in the direction of Kamyanka, where the Russian Ministry of Defense reported the full capture of the town. If we take a look at the town, we see that the Russians now have a secure foothold in the southern and eastern parts of the town, and it is likely that they do have gained full control of it. However, without evidence, we'll have to keep it as a gray zone. This will allow the Russians to gain control over the only town in the area and a solid foundation for further supply logistics here across the Oskar river line. It will allow the Russians to connect from Topoli along the border area through Kamyanka and through these roads all the way towards Vyolivka in the south, which is a speed bump for the Russian forces in the area. They do have control over the road, however it is within close proximity to the Ukrainian forces, which means the Russians also need to secure Vyolivka. But if they do capture Vyolivka as well as Kamyanka, they'll have a secure supply route from Topoli in the north through Kamyanka all the way through towards the Orishna and then onwards towards Zapadne and to the northern outskirts of Kupiansk. This allowed the Russians to have a significant bridgehead across the Oskar river line that is well connected from the northern to the southern outskirts. Finally, there was an attempted advance by the Russians here in the Sumi region, where two motorcycles were driving along one of the roads here in the area, where they then struck a mine which demolished both motorcycles, and it is unlikely anyone survived from such a crash. We see from this that the minefields are also able to hold back even smaller vehicles such as motorcycles, and this makes it difficult for the Russians to advance here near the areas where the Ukrainians have significant minefields, but also indicates that the Ukrainians are not planning on offensive operations anytime soon in the area, as they have laid minefields, which makes it difficult for them themselves to advance. Instead, they are completely on the defense, which is clearly shown with the territorial developments in the area, but it also shows that the Russians are here pressuring the Ukrainians heavily for control over Luknia and Yunikivka in the east, to generally create a buffer zone along the border area between the Sumi and the Kursk regions, but also for further offensive developments here in the Sumi region in the future. It's likely it will be similar to the Kharkiv region, where they simply gain a foothold and then move on to defense. But so far, the Russians need to secure much more if they are able to even establish such a defensive position. At the very least, they need to capture Yunikivka and the towns alongside this border area for a secure foothold across from Oleksivka in the west to Yunikivka in the east. The forest patches here in the east near Setki would also be significant for the bridgehead across the border area. The Russians have yet to completely secure the Kursk region, as Ukrainians still have a few square kilometers of control within it, mostly in the forest lines and forest patches and along the marsh area. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.